evening, everyone. Welcome to the National Atomic Testing Museum. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect. My name is good. All right. So my name is Joseph Kent. I'm the Director of Education here at the museum. And on behalf of the staff, the volunteers, the Nevada Test Site Historical Foundation, we are so excited to have you all here tonight. So welcome to the museum. Thank you for coming tonight. Whether this was your first lecture at the museum, or if you've been coming to every single one that we've had over the years, thank you so much. We're thrilled to have you. And before we get started, I do want to mention the next event that we have coming up for our Distinguished Lecture Series is on April 9th. And this is going to be Jeffrey Beaumont. And he's going to be giving a presentation called Artists of the Fleet, the Life and Art of Arthur Beaumont, his father. And you can actually see in this room, we have an exhibit on the artwork of Arthur Beaumont, some of which haven't been on display since 1947. So he's going to be talking about his father's life, his father's artwork, and so we're really excited to have that for the next one. But that's not the thing we're focusing on tonight. The thing we're going to be focusing on are these two gentlemen over here, their distinguished careers. So Vince is a historian and curator of the International Spy Museum, as well as the author of Nuking the Moon and Nuclear Spies, which are available in the museum's gift shop. And they also were both published in 2019. And then also Dr. John Browne is the director of Los Alamos National Laboratory, and he's been a member of our Board of Trustees since 2004. And both are actually on our National Advisory Committee. So they're a big part of the direction that the museum is going in. So we're excited for their conversation tonight and excited to have all of you here. And without further ado, help me give a welcome to warm applause to these guys.
Good evening. Can you hear me okay?
No.
Hello. How's that? No? Maybe I need to move it up a little louder. How's that? Still? All right. Here. How's that? That's better? Okay. Welcome. This is going to be a little different type of talk than you're used to. This is going to be a conversation between Vince and myself and you. So we're hoping you'll engage with us with your questions or comments as we talk about this very interesting topic, I think, of nuclear spies. Vince, I'm going to start by asking you a question about the title of your book. Jordan, who's with us tonight, sent me an email about a year and a half ago and said, would you be willing to review a manuscript by a fellow who's writing this book about nuclear spies? And I thought your background at Los Alamos might really help. And so I said, oh, sure, I'd love to do that. So I read it and I said, wow, this is really an interesting book. They had some things in here I didn't even know, and I thought I knew a lot about what had happened during the war. But the thing about your title is, most people, when they see the nuclear spies, the first thing that goes through their mind is Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, right? Almost anybody you pick off the street, they'll say, the Rosenbergs, right? This is not about the Rosenbergs.
It's like a paragraph about the Rosenbergs. No, it's not. It's the opposite. It's not people spying on us, it's actually us spying on other people. The concept behind it is actually what makes it, I believe, unique. And if it wasn't unique, I wouldn't have gotten, this was my dissertation, so it wouldn't have gotten my PhD if it hadn't been unique, was that we had a very vigorous atomic intelligence program, not only during the Second World War, but also even to this day, but certainly in the early Cold War. And I can give you a little bit of inside baseball. This wasn't the original title. This was a negotiated title with Cornell University Press. I'm sad my original title didn't exist because anyone heard of Werner Heisenberg? Werner Heisenberg is a big part of this book, and Heisenberg is well known for the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. And so I had a little fun thing I thought was fun. The original title was The Principal Uncertainty. And it was P-R-I-N-C-I-P-A-L, uncertainty, like the most important unknown that we had during World War II was Germany beating us at the atomic bomb race. And not only was that a nice little play on words on Heisenberg, but the initials would be PU, which any chemist in this room knows, is the atomic symbol for plutonium. I'm like, it's a double pun. And Cornell was, it's way too complicated. We're gonna do the Nuclear Spies. I'm like, but everyone's gonna think the book is about the Rosenbergs, which is fine. I mean, if people buy it, that's great. It's the opposite, again. It's about what we did. And actually, the funny part is, Werner Heisenberg, who was the head of the German atomic bomb program, he was the Robert Oppenheimer for the Germans after the war, calculated that we spent more money spying on the Germans, trying to find out what they were doing in the atomic bomb, than they spent on their atomic bomb program. Because that's how much effort we put into it. We spent, even in 1940s money, hundreds of millions of dollars trying to figure out what the Germans were up to. And we were successful at it.
That's right.
And that's one of the interesting things in the book is that we pulled it off.
Yeah.
That's the first half of the book. The second half is the failure, which is how bad we fell on our face when we tried to do the same thing for the Soviets in the early Cold War, and how badly we were surprised when they were able to detonate an atomic bomb long before we assumed it.
Let me jump back into that. And why, and I think many people have heard about this, but why did the Americans, and in particular, everybody's heard about the letter that Albert Einstein wrote to President Roosevelt, which kind of led to the Manhattan Project. But there was more behind that letter. There were people who came out of the European scientific community who were petrified that the Germans were actually going to be able to develop an atomic bomb because they were more advanced in nuclear physics and nuclear technology than America was. And they were the ones that discovered nuclear fission. They were the first ones to discover that, in fact, uranium can break into two and create lots of energy. So given that, how did you focus on taking Heisenberg as the principal guy, recognizing there were a lot more players in Germany than Heisenberg, and try to understand why and who were the key players in America to come up with this project, really look into it?
Well, there are two things that we take for granted today that were not true in 1940. One is that the United States is the center of learning in the world. Everyone comes to the United States today to go to our universities, whether it's the Chinese or the Europeans or everybody else. If you want a physics degree, you go to Caltech or MIT or somewhere. If you want a business degree, you come to the United States. That wasn't the case. Germany was the place you went if you wanted a scientific degree. All the people who went on to build the atomic bomb all did their grad work in Germany. And many of them actually did their grad work under Werner Heisenberg.
That's true.
Or under his PhD advisor, a man named Arthur Sommerfeld, who was the PhD advisor for everybody, basically. And secondly, people take for granted that all the Manhattan Project scientists were well known at the time. There are heroes today, right? If you look at the periodic table of the elements, like the last row is just Manhattan Project scientist, Manhattan Project scientist, Manhattan Project, or they named it after somebody else because they were too modest to name it after, Californium, was basically because like, oh, we're not going to name it Oppenheimer, we're going to name it Berkeleyum. But it really is. I mean, Trinicium and all these other ones. These are all people today we look at as being the cream of the crop. But at the time, they were kind of the underlings. They weren't considered the world-famous scientists they are today. No, it was Werner Heisenberg, it was Otto Hahn. Well, Otto Hahn discovered nuclear fission in Germany in 1938. It was people like Hans Geiger, that name might ring a bell, the Geiger counter, right? These are people who were still in Germany. They weren't Jewish, they didn't have to leave. They stayed back to help the Germans win the war. And what great anecdote, if you talk about in 1930-something, the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, which was, if you imagine if you took MIT, Caltech, and like Chicago and rolled them all into one, it had three major institutes. It had one for chemistry, one for physics, and one was called physical chemistry. The head of the physics institute was Albert Einstein. The head of the physical chemistry institute was Otto Hahn. And the head of the chemistry institute was a guy named Fritz Haber. And Fritz Haber won the Nobel Prize for chemistry for finding a way to pull ammonium out of the air and nitrates out of the air, which was great for keeping billions of people alive through fertilizers and other things like that. It also kept the German army in World War I for about 2 years longer than they would have, as you could make explosives. But those are the guys who headed those institutes. Talk about the place to go if you wanted a scientific education.
So let me jump in just to give people an idea. When I started in physics, one of the requirements to get a PhD was to pass a course in scientific German. Today, you go into a university, you won't see a course in scientific German. And that's a challenge. I mean, I studied German as an undergraduate, but in scientific German, all the words are about this long, you know. But anyway, that's just the point that even in the 60s, German was still viewed as a focus for scientific endeavors.
And you were the director of Los Alamos within the last, all of our lifetimes. It was not that long ago. And you were the scientific grandchild of all of these German professors, because people like, Teller directly studied under Heisenberg. People like Hans Bethe. When I did this dissertation, one of my professors on my committee was a physics professor at the University of Maryland, whose PhD advisor was Hans Bethe. These are guys who worked on the program and actually studied under these top Germans. And so you can understand when people like Leo Szilard, the Hungarian refugee, who actually wrote the Einstein letter, Einstein signed the Einstein letter, saying, FDR, we got to do something now. Because Hitler with the bomb, right? I mean, we look back in hindsight and we realize they didn't get there. And they didn't get all that close to it. But if you're an American or if you're a Jewish refugee, that is the nightmare scenario. And it's not one of these things, I mean, people have tried to counterfactual history, go back and say, well, maybe he wouldn't have used it. Well, Albert Speer was his head of science and technology, his Vannevar Bush, who was our guy. And Albert Speer, very straightforward, said, there's no question in his mind that if Hitler got his hands on a bomb, it would have been used. It would be used like instantaneously.
Yes, the most likely London, he said.
Well, London for sure as a terror weapon, but you can imagine an atomic attack on Normandy Beach in June of 1944, right? Forget it. We're speaking English, the rest of the world's speaking German right now, because that's not a situation that anyone wanted to think about. And so the passion behind getting this program started was so much so that the early scientists, talking about Hans Bethe was one of them, his best friend, a guy named Viktor Weizkopf, Hungarian, actually Czech, Romanian, they're all the Weizkopf and Bethe concocted this plan to go over and kidnap Heisenberg.
Yes, right.
And they weren't James Bonding this. They were just like, we're just gonna go grab him and punch him and throw him in a car and try to drive off. And they're like, and so that actually went up the ranks.
That's right.
Until Leslie Groves was like, no, you're not. No, you're not gonna do this. And the problem they ran into was a problem that I lay out in the book, and the fact is, they had to come up with those plans because no one else was. The American intelligence establishment, number one, didn't know what was happening in New Mexico at the time. Had no idea about this whole atomic bomb thing going on. And even if they did know, they didn't have any way of doing it. It's not like the CIA today. It's not like the Americans where we have 17 intelligence agencies. That's making noise. 17 intelligence agencies today. We had Army intelligence, who was very good at figuring out how good the German tanks were, but not much else. We had naval intelligence, which was very good at missing the fact that we were about to be attacked at Pearl Harbor. We had the newfound OSS, which, now we look back as being like the precursor to the CIA, but the OSS around the rest of the government stood for OSO Social, not the Office of Strategic Services. It was a bunch of people who went to Georgetown bars and talked about, what can we do? Let's go kidnap Hitler and all these crazy ideas. So you didn't have an intelligence establishment that could actually do this work for you. So the scientists were like, well, let's do it ourselves.
Well, talk about Groves in this respect, because to me, this is something that most people don't realize. Everybody sees Groves as the guy who built the Pentagon, which I think most people knew. He did that before he did the Manhattan Project. And then he ran the Manhattan Project in a way that kept the scientists engaged, because in the beginning, he wanted them all to join the Army and wear uniforms, and they revolted. And Oppenheimer had a negotiation with Groves and basically said, okay, you win, I can't get these guys to work on it, it won't be much of a project. But the other piece of this is that in addition to that, Groves played one of the key roles, or if not the key role, in intelligence during this period.
In 1942, George Marshall, who was the Chief of Staff of the United States Army, he was running the war, called Groves in and said, look, I know you got enough going on right now, but you're the only guy I can have do this, is we have a problem. is we have a bunch of scientists who understand what's going on in Germany with atomic weapons, but they don't know anything about intelligence collection. And we have a bunch of intelligence professionals that are okay at doing the intelligence side, but they don't know anything about physics, right? They're all lawyers and they're business people and they're all, getting the cream of the crop of American society with people that went into American intelligence. You're the only one that kind of crosses over in the fact that he certainly understood as an engineer the basics of what was happening under him, or he could go to Oppenheimer and ask if he needed to. But he also had run a very, well, today we know it wasn't a very effective counterintelligence program, but at the time, what they assumed to be a very effective counterintelligence program to protect the Manhattan Project. So he knew intel. He's really the only one that could come together. So Marshall's like, look, I know you got a lot going on, but we want you to run the American Atomic Intelligence Program. And Groves is like, look, how am I gonna do this? I'm a one-star general and I just became a one-star general. And that's another great story, is that Oppenheimer whispered in Groves' ear, he's like, he was a colonel at the time. He's like, no one's gonna listen to you, Colonel Groves. You gotta go get a star on your shoulder. And so Groves went to the Army and said, if you don't make me a general, I can't take this job. And so they made him, they basically, you're a general, right? Because the scientists weren't gonna listen to Colonel Groves. They might listen to General Groves, which they did, but he was a newly minted one-star general. The head of Army Intelligence was a two-star general who had been around forever. The head of Naval Intelligence was a two-star admiral who had been around forever. And the head of OSS was General William Donovan, who was not only a two-star general, but the most decorated soldier in American history. He's still the only American to have been awarded the top 4 awards for bravery: the Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, and the Silver and Bronze Stars. And Groves was being put in charge of all of them when it came to atomic intelligence. And he's like, how the hell, these guys aren't gonna listen to me?
Yeah.
And so Marshall actually had to go read him the Wright Act and went to both O&I, Naval Intelligence, and G2, Army Intelligence, said, I know he's a nobody. I know you've never even heard of this guy before, because he's an engineer. But when he says something that has to do with nuclear stuff, you do what he says.
Yeah.
Even at the end of the war, Eisenhower was put in that. 5-star General Eisenhower was called to the carpet in front of George Marshall. And Marshall said, what Groves says goes when it comes to intelligence about atomic weapons. Now, Groves actually went and talked to Donovan face to face, and so Donovan was willing to do anything for him at that point. Because we talked about the OSS being oh so social, Groves was the first general ever to visit Donovan in his office. Right? They always sent their lackeys, and they're like, here's Captain so-and-so. And so Groves went in person, and Donovan was like, I'll do anything you want. So the OSS is very helpful, and that's where you get like Bo Berg and all those stories that come into play. But at that point, he still didn't know what he was going to do, right? He had gotten the power. But he's like, okay, now what? And that's where we take for granted today that we have this apparatus set up, like we have this massive intelligence agency. He had to figure out how to build it. He had to figure out, how do I recruit people? How do I get scientists to actually go and be spies? And I can't send Oppenheimer overseas because he's captured, the gig's up, they know what we're doing. I can't send any of my top people overseas because, again, if they're captured, I have a problem. So I have to send a physicist that knows nothing about what's happening in Los Alamos, but knows the physics behind it, overseas to be my top spy. That was a guy named Sam Goudsmit, who is a name people don't know a whole lot about, but he was certainly motivated.
And he had experience with the German scientists, which is very important.
He was arguably best friend, the American who was best friends with Werner Heisenberg.
Yeah.
Heisenberg stayed at Goudsmit's house for a couple weeks before the war began. He was a professor up at the University of Michigan. And stayed with him. Enrico Fermi and Goudsmit conspired to get Oppenheimer to take a vacation in Michigan at the end of the summer, to where they just basically harassed him for 3 weeks. Stay in the United States, stay in the United States, stay in the United States. Any job you want is yours. Yeah. Right? I mean, Albert Einstein, this is when Princeton had started the Institute for Advanced Studies. Einstein was like, you can be my number 2, Caltech, Chicago, Berkeley, be in charge of the physics department. This is Werner Heisenberg, right? This is the guy who was all their professors, and to everyone's chagrin, and actually what scared the hell out of everybody, was he said, no, I have to go work and help Germany win this war.
Yeah,
that was the one where it was like, oh crap.
That opens up a question, I think, an important one, that a lot of you, I think, have probably heard about or read about, and that is there was some information that leaked out through Niels Bohr And you probably know that name is the father of the atom, the Bohr atom back in the early 1900s. Niels Bohr was kind of the premier scientist in Europe at that time. Heisenberg looked at Niels Bohr as a father.
Right.
And Niels Bohr Heisenberg came to visit Niels Bohr at his institute in Denmark. And they had an exchange. And there's been a play written about that. Maybe some of you have seen it. It's called Copenhagen. And it's the story of the interaction between Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg over this question of whether Germany is developing a nuclear bomb or not. And it's a very interesting story because it's not something you can definitively put your finger on and say, aha, they are or they aren't.
See, I can, and that's where it's interesting, is that this has been something people have been arguing about for decades. And a guy named David Irvin wrote a book called Brighter Than a Thousand Suns,
Right.
where Heisenberg was his top source for the book. And this created this myth that Heisenberg was purposely trying to sabotage the German atomic bomb program, where they worked really slowly, or they took time off, or they gave bad information, because none of the Germans wanted Hitler to have a bomb. That flies in the face of everything we know, and especially flies in the face of what we know from Copenhagen. Now, we don't know the exact thing they talked about because it wasn't written down, it wasn't recorded. We do know that Niels Bohr left Copenhagen right after the conversation, went to London, and talked to the top scientific intelligence guys in London. A guy named R.V. Jones, a guy named Rudolf Perez, Eric Welsh, and they got terrified. They started kicking off telegrams to Groves in the United States saying, Bohr's coming over, you gotta talk to Bohr, he's got some information for you. And so then Bohr went to the United States and talked to Fermi and Oppenheimer and everybody else, and we know from that conversation that there was a big meeting and they really kicked up the effort after that. So you can extrapolate whatever you want to, and you can say they talked about tulips in Copenhagen, but Bohr talked to the British and the Americans, and in both cases, they said, oh God, like we're in big trouble. So as a historian, again, I can't prove it, but if it walks like a duck and it talks like a duck, I mean, this is one where, and Bohr, that's how you pronounce his name, A-A-G-E, the Danish, the Dutch native Turkey.
Bohr.
See, not even close, right? But it's spelled A-A-G-E, so for whatever reason. That's for historians, sometimes we've only read things. He confirms this. He says that his dad came back from that meeting as, Niels Bohr was as white as it came anyway, but a whiter shade of white. And kind of come back like almost ashen, like, oh my God, like we're in big trouble.
So that then opens up the big question of, so here you have the brightest scientists, a very powerful industrial engine under Speer, built massive numbers of ships and you name it, airplanes, tanks, etc. Why couldn't they pull it off when we did?
Well, so there's two ways to look at this. One is they did have this massive industrial base, but they had to focus it on ships and planes and submarines and stuff, whereas the United States could have their cake and eat it too. We could spend $2 billion in 1940 money on the Manhattan Project and still churn out a new Sherman tank every 45 seconds in Detroit. The Germans had to choose. Now, they almost chose to go after an atomic bomb. And the wonderful history about this is there was a math error. That when they originally sat down, and we did this too, right? We had mathematicians at Los Alamos sit down and try to figure out how much would the critical mass of U-235 be to create an atomic bomb. So the quick story is if we pulled a chunk of uranium out of the ground, the vast majority of that chunk of uranium, 99.3%, would be an isotope uranium-238. That's not, you're not going to make an atomic bomb out of uranium-238, but 0.7% of that is uranium-235, which is fissionable, very, very fissionable. They discovered this in the 1930s. Otto Hahn was a big part of this. Later on, they discovered that and then later plutonium, which you actually made by taking uranium and then running it through what we now would consider a nuclear reactor, are the two things you're going to make a bomb out of. Well, the big question was, how much damn uranium-235 would we need to build a bomb? This is a math question. We sat down and we did the math and we figured out you probably need, a softball size core that's still classified actually, so you can't even tell me how much it is, of uranium-235. The Germans sat down and actually gave the math to a guy named Walter Bothe, B-O-T-H-E, who was the top mathematician in Germany, right? He is the guy, the John Nash, if you've seen Beautiful Mind, right? He's the guy who knows math better than anybody on earth. And this is a math problem that if you took a notebook and fill up the entire notebook, right? This isn't like 9 plus 5. This is a huge multivariable calculus differential equation math problem. But for both of it, it should have been easy, and it was. And he did it, and he knocked it out and said, hey, we're gonna need kilograms of uranium-235 to make a critical mass. We're gonna need a massive amount. And it turned out that he made a very minor math error. It would be like for us mere math mortals, he forgot to carry the 1 in a long division problem, right? But the differential equations version of that. And because he was the guy, no one checked his work. You could have had a first-year grad student go back and say, oh, no, look, you did this here, and you meant to do this here, and they would have realized it was a much smaller critical mass. But this was work they were waiting on, and so Heisenberg and Albert Speer actually went and met with the German leadership, and they asked them, can you build us this bomb? And they said, probably, but we're gonna have to basically shut down all German manufacturing to focus on it. And that was where Hitler said, I maybe can build a bomb, but I know I can build tanks and fighters and ships and everything else, so I'm not gonna take the chance.
Also rockets.
Then rockets. Ironically, that was in 1942, the same time that George Marshall was talking to Leslie Groves saying, you need to build up this intelligence, to figure out what the actual Germans are up to. So literally at the exact same time the Germans were essentially shutting down their program is when we were gearing up to do our intelligence about it. We had no idea, of course, that they were doing this. We assumed that they were building a bomb till the very end. And so...
Well, they didn't totally shut their program down.
No, it was basically laboratory work after that, where they built an atomic pile, which is kind of...
Tried to do what Fermi did
Right,
in Chicago, but were unsuccessful.
They got very close. They never actually created a self-sustaining chain reaction,
Right.
which is what today we would call a nuclear reactor. But they got kind of close. But that was in 1945, at the end of the war.
Yeah, I think many of you have heard the story of the heavy water bombings that the U.S. did, where we had the British commandos went in and destroyed the heavy water production plants. And in Norway, that threw the German program way back in time because they had chosen to use heavy water as the moderator, the thing that slows neutrons down, that allows fission to occur in uranium. The US chose to use graphite.
Right.
And you might say, why didn't the Germans try to use graphite? Well, they did. And it didn't work for them. And there was a reason, and Fermi figured out how pure the graphite had to be for it to work, and the Germans didn't. Their graphite had impurities in it, and so when they tried it, the neutrons got captured up by the impurities, and so it wouldn't create a chain reaction.
When heavy water was just as bad, it turned out if they tried to go all the way through, it wouldn't have worked all that well. If you ever make it out to DC in the Spy Museum, we have a vial of heavy water from that Norwegian plant that was bombed. That's an amazing story. But you want to talk about Groves' power at that point. He allowed that to happen. So he knew what was going on. He allowed the British and the Norwegians to send commandos in to, this is as spy movie as it gets. They skied down out of the mountain. They'd been parachuted and glidered down. They skied down out of the mountains, crawled through the air ducts, jumped down, and blew up these huge tanks of heavy water. And it was wonderful, as a historian, it must have sucked at the time, is watching a series of reports about the damage. Because the first report that came out about 3 days later was, the heavy water plant has been completely destroyed. It's going to take the Germans 2 years to put it back in action. 4 days later, another report comes out and says, not as bad as we thought. It's probably going to take about 6 months for them to get it back in action. The Groves is reading these. And then a week later, it's like, ooh, we kind of really blew this. They're going to have it back in about 3 weeks. And Groves is like, you know what, you tried. So Groves called a guy named Carl Spaatz, who was the Army Air Force general, and said, I need you to do a bombing mission for me. And Spaatz is like, Brigadier General Groves, what are you calling me? And he goes, just wait, and Marshal Spaatz, and oh, what do you need? Over 1,000 bombers, B-17s were sent to flatten the area that this Norwegian heavy water plant was. But not only the Norwegian heavy water plant, but 3 other quasi-military targets around the area. Why? What happens if you target the heavy water plant specifically? What do the Germans know? That, number one, we think they're doing something fishy with heavy water. And what could that be? Doing an atomic bomb. So Groves made it look as though it was just a flat Norway, but the entire U.S. Army, the 8th Army Air Force, got sent in on the word of Leslie Groves, basically blow up Norway to make sure the Germans didn't get their heavy water. That's not the last time that he was able to do that.
Yeah, that's right. Well, it's interesting when these people at Groves assembled finally got a chance to get into Europe after D-Day, because before that they had some forays into Europe, but it was not successful really. What do you think allowed them to get in so quickly and basically beat the Soviets?
Yeah.
Frankly, the Soviets knew about this and were trying to get to the same scientists as we were. Why did we win that battle?
It's hard. There's different kinds of historians. There are historians that look at process and organization. They look at kind of take everything in stride. And there's historians that look at special people, right? Kind of the heroes. I'm not a hero historian, but there is kind of a hero in this section of the book. A young, to me now, I wasn't young when I started writing this, a lot older than I was when I started writing this, but a young 40-year-old colonel named Boris Pash, who has an incredible biography. This is a guy who fought the Soviets as a 17-year-old in Russia during the Bolshevik Revolution, and then later on actually cleared all the Manhattan Project scientists as a member of the Counterintelligence Corps. He's the guy who let Oppenheimer in the security clearance to work on the Manhattan Project, was pulled on personally by Groves to lead this program, and he had no fear, zero fear. And to the point where they got shot at, they got sniped, they got blown up, and he's like, we gotta get in there, we gotta get these guys. And he and Sam Goudsmit, who was the head of the scientific branch of this, were going in some cases, to places that were not secure yet. But the Germans were still there, and they were sneaking in to grab these scientists that would have possible information about what the Germans were doing. And the most hairy of them all was the daughter and son-in-law of Marie and Pierre Curie, Irene Joliot Curie and Frederick Joliot Curie. Frederick Joliot Curie was the Oppenheimer of France.
Yeah.
He was the top scientist, the top physicist of France, and of course his wife, later on we get a Nobel Prize also, they both had Nobel Prizes. That family, I think, had 5 Nobel Prizes in it.
Yeah.
One of them being a Peace Prize, but all the rest for physics and chemistry. Talk about genetics, right? The genetic study of that family. But Frederick Joliot Curie was a card-carrying member of the Communist Party. And I'm not being kind of McCarthyist there. He had a membership card of the, he was a full-fledged commie.
Yeah.
And the idea was that if he found out what was going on, he'd immediately pass it to the Soviets. So the idea was to get to him as fast as you possibly could. And so there's a wonderful anecdote about Pash and his team getting really impatient because the French were promised the liberation of Paris. Right? We did all the heavy lifting, all the hard work, the British, the Americans, the Canadians, got to right to the outskirts of Paris, and then General de Gaulle and Leclerc and all the Free French would swoop in to Paris, but they were kind of just taking their time, and Pash needed to get in there. And so he's like, you know what, just go. Just go. And so they tear through these basically checkpoints the French had set up, and they finally stopped one of the jeeps and asked this young lieutenant who thought on his feet innocently, like, what are you doing? And it's like, well, we had some tanks go through, and we want to make sure that we stop them so that the French are the first ones to go in. So we're racing ahead to try to stop those tanks. He's like, well, go, go, go. The French guy goes back, gets on the radio to General Leclerc, and the Americans have double-crossed us. They're beating us into Paris, and Leclerc calls de Gaulle, and they're like, go, go, go. And so the French army attacks Paris because of, Boris Pash and his crew. But we do, that's an anecdote, Boris Pash is the only one that said it. But we do know for a fact that the first 3 combat vehicles into Paris were 2 French tanks and a U.S. Army Jeep carrying Boris Pash and 3 scientists who raced and dodged enemy fire to go capture capture's the wrong word, to go secure Frederick Joliot Curie. And then the story later on about Heisenberg is one of my favorite, where they finally catch up to him 3 days before the end of the war. And he's waiting for them, because he's hearing about all his compatriots being picked up. And so Pash like kicks down the door to his house, and Heisenberg has a suitcase in his bag, sitting on the bed waiting. He's like, I was expecting you. And so like, all right, well, we're gonna leave in the morning. And it turned out that Pash and his team of like 10 people go to grab this headquarters next door to this house. And it turns out in the middle of the night, they hear a knock on the door, and a SS 2-star general knocks on the door. So it's German SS, and says, I'm here to surrender my corps. Now, an army corps is thousands of soldiers. My army corps to your general. And Pash is like, Army corps? He's got 10 guys. And up in the mountains, there are about 15,000 SS Germans. And he's like, well, if they know how many people we have, we're all dead. And he's like, well, my general's taking a nap. Come back in the morning. And so the general leaves. He's like, fine, he leaves. Pash, let's go. They grab Heisenberg, we're leaving now. And so they jump in and they take off. But those are the kind of ways that where Groves has always been known as a micromanager. And actually, one of the interesting things I found for this book that had, we don't necessarily like to tout ourselves, but one thing I found as a source for this book that no one had ever seen before was in the 1960s, someone asked Leslie Groves to write a chapter in a business school textbook. So it was for an MBA program, and it was a textbook of like management practices, management 101. And it had all these leaders of industry in it, and there's a Leslie Groves chapter about like how I do things. And basically he's like, I don't manage, I tell people what to do. Like I don't delegate, I don't have to, but there were about 3 or 4 people that he trusted. And Pash was one of these guys. And so Pash very much said, I will report in on what I did, but I want to ask permission to do it. And that gave him this flexibility to make these crazy decisions of, yeah, we're going. Well, I'm not going to wait for permission. We're going in. They're like, but we haven't secured that area yet. So it doesn't matter, we're going in. We'll deal with it later on. And that's how we beat the Soviets to some of these people, and that was essential.
Let me open up a different vein now, which I think is another piece of your book. And that is Pash, as you mentioned earlier, was also the head of counterintelligence for the Manhattan Project, the one who vets everybody to make sure that we don't have any spies. Well, we had a lot of spies in the Manhattan Project. I think, we talked about the Rosenbergs, but you could go through a list, and even recently, Bill Broad of the New York Times talked about a 4th spy out of Los Alamos, and I think actually some would count a 5th spy.
No one mentions George Koval, who is the most interesting one of all of them.
I agree.
He's actually a GRU trained. GRU is Soviet military intelligence. A GRU trained officer who infiltrated the Manhattan Project.
He was an American citizen.
Yes. So American citizen who had gone to the Soviet Union, learned how to be an engineer, done all the physics course and everything over there, but looked young enough that when they sent him back to the United States, he re-enrolled in college as a freshman. And people were amazed at how good he was at all this stuff, right? It's like, God, you're a natural, right? You look at it once and you know exactly how to do it. This is exactly the time that they're headhunting for the Manhattan Project. So they bring him on and they realize that he was so well-rounded, they made him the chief safety officer, basically.
Right.
So his job was to go around making sure the labs were doing...
Chuck, you would relate to him, right?
He was the safety guy, right?
You're
wearing your goggles.
Safety guy. He went all over the complex.
So he was the guy who went in like, you're not wearing your goggles right, or whatever. Which
but he had access. He had access.
Everything.
He had access to everything because he was the radiation safety officer.
So a GRU officer. So everyone, the Rosenbergs, there's not enough time to talk about how inconsequential they were, to the Soviet program. But people like Koval, people like Ted Hall, and Ted Hall is someone, they called him the kid, because he was 19, talk about how smart he was. He worked very closely on not only the plutonium problem, but later on the thermonuclear question with Edward Teller. He was just passing along information to the Soviets directly. And then, of course, you had Klaus Fuchs, and then David Greenglass, he was a machinist who tied the Rosenbergs into everything. But I ignored that for the most part because, number one, we didn't know about it when these guys were doing it. That comes later on, so I don't play the whole, they should have seen it coming thing. I only went with what they knew about it at the time. They had no idea that they were spies at the time. But number two, I'm a firm believer in what not only Glenn Seaborg said, but others as well, that the only secret of the atomic bomb was whether or not it would work. Hiroshima and Nagasaki kind of showed the world that that secret was out. This is basic physics, right? This is not magic that only Americans can figure out. This is physics that, some of the Soviet scientists like Peter Kapitsa, like Igor Kurchatov, obviously, you've got some of the greatest minds in the world in the Soviet Union.
You also have people in Pakistan and
well, right,
North
right,
Korea.
yeah. I mean, you have Andrei Sakharov, who was, the key with the Soviet thermonuclear weapon. They're not dummies, although we thought they were. That's the second half of this book,
Right.
is that while we looked at the Germans and thought they walked on water, we looked at the Soviets and thought they were a bunch of morons. And people you've worked with, actually, Herbert York might be a name that's familiar to some people in this room, tells he has this joke that he always told when he got called into the Pentagon. The generals were very worried when Herbert York actually went on to become the AEC chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission. And so he got called into the Pentagon and they asked him, how likely is it that the Soviets are going to come into New York or DC or some major city with a suitcase nuke? Can they smuggle a nuke in with a suitcase? Because of course, everyone in the Pentagon was looking at ICBMs and creating all these systems to defend from ICBMs. And New York's like, I'm not worried about it at all. And they're like, how can you possibly be so nonchalant about this? He's like, the Soviets could blow up New York with a suitcase nuke. He goes, no, how can you be so sure? Well, the Soviets haven't really figured out the technology for the suitcase yet. So we're not too worried about the atomic bomb side of it. That was the mentality at the time. The head of the American rocket program, not Wernher von Braun, he wasn't the head of anything, he was a top scientist. The US Air Force guy was the head of it, literally said we thought they were a bunch of morons. Groves, at the end of the war, brings this committee together of all the top manufacturers that worked with the Manhattan Project. Dow Chemical and DuPont and Westinghouse and all these people who had built Oak Ridge and built Tennessee Eastman and built Hanford and all these places and said, how good are the Soviets at this? Because they had all gone over for Lend-Lease and helped the Soviets build factories for tanks and stuff like that too. And there's this wonderful transcript of them talking about how ridiculously backward the Soviets were. And one of the guys, I believe it was the guy from DuPont, said, look, we're talking about a society where their best and greatest technological achievement was a two-seated farm tractor, which was only good for young Soviet pioneers, which is like the Boy Scouts, because the pioneer and his girlfriend could go off into the field and create more Soviets. But there was no real appreciation of the capabilities. And what blew my mind when I was researching this is that no one had really kind of appreciated what that meant for American intelligence. Right. And we all know that American intelligence collapsed at the end of the war. And it was built back up very slowly. 1947, the CIA is created. 1949, the Soviets get the bomb. But it's not really until after 1957 and the launch of Sputnik where the Americans' eyes were open to the fact that the Soviets could do science. Right? That, oh my God, they have pretty good physicists. Alex broke something. The plug. I'll be loud until after Sputnik that people realized that the Soviets knew what the hell they were doing. At this point, though, no one believed the Soviets were good at anything. And so the reason that scientific intelligence was allowed to collapse wasn't because of budgetary constraints. It wasn't because people were worried about an American Gestapo. It wasn't because we didn't have scientists who were willing to do spying for us. It wasn't because of any of these reasons. It was because we didn't think we had to. We thought we had all the time in the world to figure out what the Soviets were up to. General Groves, talk about the guy who should know better, was asked how long it would be before the Soviets got the atomic bomb. He said 20 years, at the low end. That's because he was looking at the industrial side of things. And can you blame him? Right? He knew how much it took to build the atomic bomb. He built like 4 cities, basically. Right? Hanford, Washington, Oak Ridge, Tennessee. He built Los Alamos to create this 2 little bombs that today would be considered tactical nuclear weapons. They were so small. He understood how much work it took. And he has a very famous, like, the only way they could possibly pull this off is if they ignore everything else in their entire economy and just focus 100% on this. But of course, they're not going to do that. Well, that's exactly what they did, right? And then Truman, the president of the United States, who could have put a lot of money into the CIA much earlier to do this, was asked, when do you think the Soviets are going to get the bomb? Never was his response. Never. And then when they finally get the bomb, it takes a month before he's convinced that actually they had an atomic bomb.
Yeah.
He refused to believe it. And he very famously said, I thought those Asiatics would never be able to pull this off. He used that word, Asiatics. And it took Lewis Johnson and others, and Oppenheimer had to come in and be like, they built a damn bomb.
You know,
Right.
the interesting point I always felt, and we learned this after the collapse of the Soviet Union, was that all these spies were the reason the Soviets were successful and built a bomb. What we learned when we got a chance to go over and visit with our counterparts in Russia after 1993 and for the following period of time was that they had an actual operating design that would have worked. They didn't test it. You know what they tested? They tested the design that they stole from the Americans, and the reason they tested that one was the head of their KGB, Beria, who worked for Stalin, said, if it doesn't work, we're going to shoot all of you. So they knew the American Trinity device worked, so they said, hell with that, we're going to... But they knew their device worked. And, you know, they were very proud of the fact when we interacted with them, it was not, we didn't need to steal it from you, we knew how to do it.
The wonderful thing is the only people that had less regard for Soviet scientists than the Americans were the Soviets. The Soviet leadership thought their own scientists were idiots. And the only time they believed anything that like Kurchatov and other came is when Beria was able to come in and say, no, the Americans did it the same way.
Yeah.
So he's telling the truth. And then Stalin would believe them. So it's hard for me to blame American intelligence for missing this when the Soviets didn't even think they had good scientists, right? They thought they had a bunch of idiots on their hands also. And so I try not to be, and actually, the kind of, I know we're running up against time, we haven't even asked you for questions, is I actually ended up with a book I didn't expect to write. Because I set out to write this, ask a historical question, how did we get the Soviet thing so wrong when we got the German thing so right? Right? We did something so well. How did we have such an anomaly? How did we fall on our faces so badly with the Soviets? And it turned out that the anomaly wasn't the Soviet case. It was the German case. And looking at how closely or how badly we predicted when the Israelis were going to get a bomb, when the North Koreans were going to get a bomb, when the Pakistanis, the Indians, the French, the Chinese, we missed it on every one of them.
Yep.
So the question really should have been, how did we get it so right? And that's what this book, at the end I had to go, I've got the wrong question here. And so I rewrote some stuff and it became, how did Groves do this? And it was less about how bad were we in those 4 years between 45 and 49, but how good were we in those 3 years between 42 and 45. So it became, and I liked it a much more celebratory book of how well that we did during this war versus how badly we did afterwards.
Yeah. Maybe we should open it up while there's not a lot of time left to some of the audience.
I'm
Hopefully-
here for a couple more days, so we're good. We can go.
Yeah, it's obvious that Oppenheimer played a big role in the Manhattan Project, a brilliant theoretical physicist. Can you talk about how we treated him post-Manhattan Project?
Yeah, I mean, that to me is one of the most ridiculous tragedies of the McCarthy era. And so Oppenheimer has a security clearance renewal. So this wasn't something that was, people misinterpret this as kind of he was dragged in front of a board. But in 1954, his clearance was up for renewal. And anyone who's had a security clearance, you constantly have to get it renewed. And so his was up for renewal, and there was a lot of hubbub about should it be renewed. Not only had we started to catch some of these atomic spies, and we knew that Oppenheimer flirted with the idea of communism back in the 1930s. His girlfriend was a communist. He had some very left-leaning ideas. Actually, Viktor Weisskopf, who we talked about an hour ago, was the person who, finally convinced him that communism was a bad idea. And then, of course, you have the Oppenheimer versus Edward Teller hubbub about what they called the super at the time, which was the hydrogen bomb, the thermonuclear weapon. Teller and Oppenheimer were at odds about whether or not they should build this. And this goes back to the the mid-1940s, because the idea for the hydrogen bomb was developed while they were developing the atomic bomb. And Teller actually said, why would we build these small bombs? We can go straight to the super and like, calm down, we'll get there eventually. But there was a group of American scientists, Oppenheimer was one of them, but others were as well, who came together and created a group called the Federation of Atomic Scientists. They still exist today. They're actually called the Federation of American Scientists today. And they started a journal called the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, which you may be familiar with.
Which is still very popular.
Yes.
You can read it online.
And
it's actually quite good.
It's fantastic. But these are the guys who do the doomsday clock. So they were the ones that argued against building the thermonuclear weapon. They go, look, atomic weapons are enough. We don't need to go to the next step. If we build a thermonuclear weapon, the Soviets will too, and then we'll build the bigger one, and they'll build the bigger one, and they were right.
They were right.
They were absolutely right. The only reason that we stopped building bigger bombs was that the Soviets were worried they were going to blow a hole in the atmosphere and kill everyone. They had a design for a 100 megaton weapon that the scientists are like, we can't even test this because it's going to blow up the Earth, essentially. They did test a 58 megaton weapon, the Tsar Bomba.
Yeah, I got to see the model of that in Russia. Very impressive.
Humongous. The point, though, is that this created this division within atomic scientists. And actually, the division carries on somewhat to this day between Livermore and Los Alamos. The Los Alamos tend to be more the Oppenheimer, and the Livermore the more Teller crew. But it got so political and so charged that it actually expanded beyond the physics argument into a political argument, where Oppenheimer was basically called a traitor for not supporting the thermonuclear bomb. And so when his security clearance process came up, they called these witnesses, and including Leslie Groves and others. Boris Pash was actually a witness for him too. Right. And they were very honest. And the question Groves was asked that he regretted answering the way he did till the day he died was, if you had known the spies that were there, and if you had known Oppenheimer's relationship with communism back in the 30s, as well as you do now, would you have made him the head of the Manhattan Project? And Groves said, well, I didn't know, right? And of course, we know he wasn't a saint. He tried to get around it. And they said, answer the question. And Groves said, no, I wouldn't have. Yeah. And that was the nail, right? That was the nail in the coffin, where Leslie Groves basically saying this. But there was no evidence, anything, that he was a traitor, that he was a communist, that he was fighting it. But what it did was it was enough to strip him of his security clearance. And what do you do at that point, right? Where he went on and was a professor after that, but it really split American physics, because there's the Oppenheimer group, and it's still to this day, they're the people who kind of follow that Oppenheimer trend, and I'm one of them. I mean, I'm if you read Nuking the Moon, which is a book that is a lot less serious than this, I had the opportunity to go after Edward Teller in like 8 chapters, and I kept it to 2. But Teller is not I know there's several people in this room that were students of Teller, and they like him very much. Not someone I like very much, because he took things out of the classroom and out of the laboratory and made it political, which, making science political is kind of the anathema of science. I know it happens all the time anyway, but that's where Oppenheimer really got screwed over by all the McCarthyism of the time. What's funny about it is 2 years later, and this is a story that doesn't really get reported on that much, when starting the Israelis are actually able to steal what became known as the secret speech. Nikita Khrushchev gave a speech in front of the 20th Party Congress in 1956 in which he rips on Stalin. He talks about Stalin is like the worst, all about the crimes of Stalinism, the gulags and everything else. And the Mossad actually gets a copy of the speech, and it becomes public. And Oppenheimer finally goes to Teller and says, okay, like, we can have a conversation, because he was, like a lot of intellectuals in the 1930s, thought that McCarthyism and everything else was just a bunch of left-wing hoopla. I think when the secret speech was released and people realized how bad Stalin was and how bad the Soviet Union was, a lot of the people who had emigrated from the Eastern Bloc, like Teller, who had come from Hungary, like others who had seen communism up close in the 19-teens and 20s, were, there was a kind of a meeting of the minds. He never forgave him for basically having his security clearance stripped from him, but they got along a little bit better after that, and Oppenheimer wasn't quite as bitter. But what happened to him was a complete travesty. Sadly, I think he only lives another 10 years after that. He was a chain smoker, like 3 packs a day chain smoker, and so he died of lung cancer, or cancer more than one thing at the time, 66 or something to that effect.
Thank you. A question for Dr. Browne. You were the lab director at Los Alamos during the Wen Ho Lee days.
Yes, I was.
Can you say a few words about that? And was he a nuclear spy?
That's a good question. How many of you in the audience know the name Wen Ho Lee? Okay, pretty many know it. He was, this is an ironic story. I became director in November of 1997. The first day on the job, I was told, the FBI thinks you have a spy in your laboratory. And what job did I accept? But anyway, he's not a nuclear designer. He worked in the nuclear design division at Los Alamos. He was essentially what we would call a code guy. He built computer codes to calculate what a lot of the designers wanted to have happen. It was very suspicious what he did. All I've ever been able to say publicly is that the things he did were the worst security violation in my 34 years working at the labs. I never saw anything worse than what he did. He downloaded from his computer onto unclassified computers a copy of every US nuclear weapon design and the nuclear code that created it. So it was essentially the blueprints for the entire US nuclear design program and everything that was in our stockpile, because Los Alamos at that time had 5 of the 7 designs in the stockpile, things that were out on our submarines or on our air bases or in our missiles and so on. So why didn't he get convicted? In my opinion, it was absolutely travesty by the FBI. They blew the case so badly that when it came to trial, the government refused to tell the judge the details of what he did. It never came out publicly what he did. I mean, I can't even tell you everything he did, but he has trips to China throughout a period of about 10 years. And is he a spy? I really don't know the answer to that. You know, Los Alamos took a lot of flack, and I took a lot of personal flack over this. But we're not in the spy business. We're in the design physics business. But we were, quote, to blame because he was a spy. I don't know whether he was a spy or not. My personal opinion is that he was actually spying for Taiwan, but that's a personal opinion. Why would I say that? He's from Taiwan.
Let me just add, since you can only say so much. I can say from the intelligence perspective that if he was a spy, he did everything he would have done that he did. What I mean by that is he may not be a spy, but he sure as hell was acting like one.
Yes. Yeah.
Because that's the kind of thing where, you know, he had access to information that was classified that he took out, and we don't know if he transmitted to anybody. That's the question, right? That's why they couldn't send him to prison for his entire life, is they don't have the smoking gun of the dead drop and transmit. You know, here you go,
Chinese
President
don't
Xi.
do business that way.
Right, exactly.
The Chinese are different than the Russians.
So it's, you know, that's the one thing you couldn't catch him on, was the actual transfer of information to a foreign country. But if he wasn't a spy, what the hell was he doing? And that's the key question there.
Yeah, his argument, which doesn't hold any water for me, was he was protecting, it was job security. He was going to download all of this stuff so that if he ever got fired, he could go to another lab and tell them, see how good I am. So the whole nuclear stockpile, come on, give. Well, there's a lot of information. There are several books written about this that if you're interested in the subject, I'd recommend you read. There's one by a fellow named Ian Hoffman, who was a reporter in the Santa Fe area at the time, who I knew pretty well, and he wrote a pretty accurate book. There was some, Wen Ho Lee's connection with the China spying actually goes all the way back to 1984. So it wasn't a one-year thing. It was over a period of like 13 or 14 years where there's a lot of serious activities that were pretty scary.
And the sad part is that Wen Ho Lee's case is now used as kind of a cause célèbre for government overreach.
Yes.
And against the Chinese.
Oh, he's a hero.
Yeah, because the idea of like, look how they persecuted Wen Ho Lee. And I've had to correct people like, the FBI just fell on their face in that. It wasn't that he was innocent, it's that they just could. There's a difference. Sorry, I know. Going back to Ted Hall is a great example of this.
Yeah.
We talked about Ted Hall as being this arguably one of the worst Manhattan Project scientists. Where did he go to prison? He didn't.
Never.
They could never prosecute him because the only reason they knew he existed was a like beyond top secret program the NSA ran called Venona, where they had broken Soviet codes. And in the Soviet codes, they had read all about Ted Hall being a spy at Los Alamos. But there's no way they could prosecute him because if they'd gone to a court of law, they'd be like, how do you know this? They weren't about to talk about the NSA reading the Soviets' mail. So Ted Hall lived the rest of his life without being prosecuted. All right?
It's essentially the same story.
Yeah, same thing.
Story.
Is that you have limitations. I mean, catching spies is not really the hard part. It's actually proving and convicting them is the real difficulty. Yeah. All right, sorry, go ahead.
No, you're good.
You actually are in charge here. So
Thanks. Does anybody else have any questions in terms, for John or Vince? Any questions at all? Oh.
Yes, concerning the Japanese in this situation, I read some articles a number of years ago. It seemed like we thought the Japanese had no idea of anything that was going on, it was like another world. But I had read that they actually had been working on nuclear materials for quite some time, and even though we sort of thought it was a total shock to them, it really wasn't.
No, it was not.
No, and because that's the whole concept of like physics is physics. It's not American physics or Japanese physics.
And they had some very brilliant nuclear physicists at that time who were part of that international community, so they knew everything that was going on in Germany and so on.
There are two major things that you have to understand. Building nuclear weapons is two big different balls that we kind of brought together in one place. One is the physics. One is understanding how it works, right? Understanding fission and understanding the critical mass and understanding all these high-level scientific concepts. That's relatively straightforward. That is physics that was figured out going back. I mean, there's a reason that H.G. Wells wrote in 1914 about atomic bombs. Just figuring out how to do it is what took the next 20, 30 years. But by 38, everyone had figured out, right? When the great, in Richard Rhodes' book, you read the fact that when word that Otto Hahn and his team had to split the atom got around the world, in chalkboards all over the planet and all over America were small, crude, rudimentary designs of bombs. Oppenheimer wrote one at Berkeley, Fermi, and all this. So people figured it out like that. That's one part of this. The other part is the manufacturing side of things, right? The fact that it takes a ridiculous amount of industry to do this. That's where the Japanese ran into problems. The Japanese had scientists that could have figured it out. They just did not have the infrastructure to create a Los Alamos, a Manhattan Project. The same thing the Germans ran into, right? The Germans could have done it, but they had to sacrifice a whole lot of other stuff. The Japanese probably couldn't have done it, period. Just because they just didn't have the like getting really kind of wonky here. They didn't have the manufacturing capability of doing really fine tools. Like I think for Oak Ridge, they had to build like 500,000 tiny little screens for some of the separation process. You're talking about machine tools that are finely graded. And the Germans invented this stuff, so they could have done it. We obviously knew how to do it. When we talk about the Japanese, not that they were stupid, it's just they hadn't really kind of focused on that kind of industry. And so they're not in a position to do it. Now, if you want to talk about the Japanese and weapons of mass destruction, you want to read about that, bioweapons. The Japanese had they were really the ones that were doing bioweapons development during World War II. The Japanese had laboratories all throughout Japan and mainland China where they were doing high-level bioweapons research. And pretty nasty stuff. If the war had gone on, which it wasn't going to, but if the war had gone on and they had decided to use some of those weapons, that could have been really ugly.
So before we end the event, Cree would like to give you some gifts on behalf of the museum. Oh, is that Cree?
So I'm going to use my outside voice versus okay? How's that?
Right.
So
I've read that book. I
know you've read this book.
Yeah.
So shockingly, so I get the fun kind of wrap up, which is to thank you for coming. Thank you for being here. And what would there be if there wasn't a little gift? So besides the mug and the hat, which we expect to have on you shortly, you get an atomic pen.
Okay.
And you get an atomic pen.
I have two
And
pens.
We here at the museum, as we look to expand, want to publish your first book written in that pen.
We write books and pens?
Apparently we do now.
We are going retro, mid-centuries, and your article about this. So thank you very much. I think it's an honor.
Thank you.